The first time I saw her was through the smudged kitchen window of our clapboard house. The late summer light turning her hair into strands of copper. She stood beside my daughter, Alma, who was waving her arms, telling some story too animated for me to hear. The girl laughed, a quick, bright sound that carried even through the glass, and I caught myself pressing a palm to the sill as if that might hold me steady. Her name was Juniper Hale. Strange name for a small town girl. Though nothing about her presence seemed small. She had moved back from Atlanta that spring, Alma had said, after things didn't work out. I never asked what things. Around here, people came home either to mend or to vanish. Sometimes both. At 65, I should have been thinking about my pension checks and the brittle arthritis in my knuckles. Instead, I was suddenly aware of the sagging drapes, the stale coffee smell in the kitchen, the way my husband's boots clomped down the hall like punctuation I had stopped reading years ago. Juniper was 28. She called me Miss Cora the first time she shook my hand on the porch. Her palm was warm, her nails bitten down. "I've heard so much about you," she said, though her eyes slid over me as if she were memorizing something private. The girls left for the county fair. I stayed behind, rinsing dishes. But the laughter lingered in my ears like the carnival music that would float over the fields. Later that night, that week, Juniper kept coming by. She and Alma sprawled on the living room rug, flipping through old photo albums. They made iced tea and left the glasses sweating rings on the oak table. Sometimes they dragged me into their chatter, asking about dances in the 70s or what gas used to cost. Juniper listened too closely, head tilted, as though my voice itself was a secret worth keeping. It wasn't long before I started hearing her in the quiet, her laugh against the clatter of dishes, her voice like a thread stitched into the hem of my thoughts. And then, one sticky evening, Alma fell asleep on the couch during a movie. Juniper slipped into the kitchen where I was tidying up. She leaned against the counter, barefoot, the hem of her sundress brushing her knees. "You keep this house so neat," she said, though I could see her eyes weren't on the counters or the shelves. I told myself it was just the heat, the cicadas, the sweet tang of peach pie cooling on the sill, but my chest ached in a way I hadn't felt in decades. That night, lying beside my husband's snore, I replayed the moment Juniper's fingers grazed mine when she passed me a plate. How quick, how deliberate, or maybe I only imagined it. And in the morning, I looked at my daughter, my own Alma, who trusted me as a mother, as a woman who'd never stray from the script of family, and I thought, I should stop this before it begins. But the truth was, it had already begun. The cicadas sang louder as September crawled toward its last week, their buzzing like a secret the night refused to keep. Alma had taken extra shifts at the diner on Main Street, and Juniper still came around. Always with some reason, dropping off borrowed books, asking about Alma's childhood stories, or simply claiming she needed company in a town that felt too small after Atlanta. I told myself it was harmless. A daughter's friend, lonely, needing warmth from a house with lights still burning past dusk. But there was a difference between telling myself something and believing it. The second time it happened, we were alone in the garden. I had been clipping dead roses, my gloves stiff with thorns, when Juniper bent down beside me, her hair falling forward like a curtain. She brushed soil from her knee and said, "I don't know how you do it. Everything you touch seems to grow." I laughed, the sound brittle. "Not everything," I muttered. The words slipped out before I could stop them. She looked up, catching the crack in my voice. Maybe not everything, Miss Cora, but enough. That night she stayed for dinner. Alma was still at work. My husband, Walter, had gone to his brother's farm to fix a fence, which meant the kitchen was only ours. I poured sweet tea into the tall glasses, and we sat across from each other, the ceiling fan chopping the silence. Juniper told me about Atlanta, the traffic, the noise, the apartment that smelled of fried onions from the neighbor downstairs. She said she missed the sound of crickets, the smell of damp earth after rain. I confessed that sometimes I missed the woman I used to be, the one who danced barefoot on tabletops at county fairs and kissed boys by the river before curfew. Do you ever feel, she asked, tracing the rim of her glass with one finger, like the world decided who you had to be, and you just obeyed? The question sliced too close. I nodded but didn't answer. Instead, I brought out the peach pie Alma and I had baked earlier. The crust cracked under my knife, releasing the syrupy sweetness. When Juniper took her first bite, she closed her eyes. And for one terrible second I wanted to kiss the sugar from her lips. I didn't, I couldn't, but the thought sat between us, steaming hotter than the pie itself. Days folded into each other. Alma noticed nothing, why would she? To her, Juniper was just a friend who needed laughter, rides into town, someone her mother didn't mind hosting. But at night, I replayed everything. The brush of Juniper's shoulder as we passed in the hallway. The way her gaze lingered when she thought I wasn't looking. The scent of lavender lotion clinging to her wrists. One Saturday, Alma convinced Walter to drive her to Knoxville for supplies. Juniper appeared on the porch not an hour later, carrying a basket of pears from her aunt's orchard. It's just us, then, she said softly when I opened the door. I should have told her to come back later. I should have thought of Alma, of Walter, of the decades of marriage that had weathered children, funerals, Sunday sermons. Instead, I stepped aside. We made jam in the kitchen, boiling fruit until the whole house smelled of caramel and autumn. At one point, I burned my finger on the bubbling pot. I hissed, dropping the spoon, and Juniper caught my hand before I could reach for the faucet. Her thumb brushed the blister, gentle as a prayer. You take care of everyone else, she whispered. Who takes care of you? Something inside me, some wall built from years of routine, cracked open. The sound of it wasn't loud, but I felt it like thunder. And then she kissed me. Quick, trembling, as though she might vanish if she lingered too long. I didn't pull away. For the first time in decades, I felt young again, not in the way wrinkles and years could deny, but in the rush of blood, the gasp of risk. The days after blurred. Nothing was spoken of that kiss, but everything had changed. When Juniper came over, we carried ourselves like thieves in daylight, smiles too careful, silences too long. One evening, Alma brought out the old home movies. She and Juniper sat cross-legged on the carpet, laughing at grainy footage of birthday cakes and summer swims. I sat behind them, unseen in the flickering light of the projector. At one point, Alma's child voice rang from the speakers, "Don't film me, Mama, film Daddy." On screen, Walter appeared, strong, laughing, holding Alma in his arms. The room swelled with nostalgia. But in that moment, watching Juniper's profile glow in the projection, I realized something shameful. I wasn't remembering the past, I was yearning for the present. The turning point came during the Harvest Festival. The whole town gathered, hayrides, pumpkin carving, gospel choirs under twinkling lights. Alma ran off with her friends. Walter joined the men at the cider stand. And Juniper slipped beside me at the quilting booth. We walked behind the church, where the air was cooler, the ground littered with dry leaves. She pressed a folded slip of paper into my palm. "Don't read it now," she said. Later that night, in my locked bathroom, I opened it. Just 6 words, scrawled in rushed ink. "I can't keep pretending, Miss Cora." I sat on the closed toilet lid, the paper trembling in my hands. Somewhere in the house, Walter coughed in his sleep. Alma's door clicked shut after a trip to the kitchen. And I thought, this secret, this hunger, would not stay hidden forever. I burned the note in the sink, but the smoke clung to the walls. The next morning, Alma found me staring at my reflection in the kitchen window. Coffee cooling untouched on the counter. "You okay, Mama?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Just tired." But in my chest, the truth was louder. I was no longer the woman they thought I was. And the choice loomed nearer every day, whether to step back into the safety of silence, or to fall fully into the fire Juniper had lit. The morning after the harvest festival, the house felt like a body in recovery, each footstep careful, each breath measured. I found myself moving through rooms as if not to wake ghosts. The note Juniper had pressed into my palm was gone from my hand, burned away like ash in the sink. But the heat of it lingered under my skin as if I had been held too close to a stove. Alma made coffee and hummed to herself while she set the table. Walter read the paper in his chair, folding his glasses back and forth the way he always did when he wanted to seem busy. They behaved with the casual intimacy of people who had long ago carved out their spaces within the same house. I watched them, feeling like an imposter in my own life, aware of how my presence bent the light differently now. Juniper did not come that day, nor the next. The absence was its own kind of company. I found myself rehearsing what I would say if she knocked on the door. Half the rehearsal resolving to end it, half of it inventing excuses to let it continue. I told myself the sensible things, my age, my obligations, the childishness of a moment's heat, but the sensible voice sounded tinny and far away. On the third morning, Alma called from the diner. "Miss Cora, can you pick up a pie? Mrs. Hargrove's sending one over for the ladies' luncheon." She sounded bright, and for a second I almost believed ordinary life could still fit around this Fisher. I picked up the pie, careful not to breathe in the fumes too deep. The pastry still felt warm, and the scent of cinnamon made my chest ache with an old hunger. When I walked back onto the porch, there she was, Juniper, sitting where we always seemed to find each other now, on the second step beneath the wisteria. The plant had tangled itself into a loose curtain of purple, petals like a confetti of dusk. She had wrapped a faded scarf around her neck despite the heat. The scarf had tiny silver beads sewn along the hem that caught the light like tiny, shy stars. She looked up when I set the pie down, and her eyes were rimmed with something that could have been sleep or tears. She didn't smile. She merely said, "You burned the note." I blinked. Yes, I burned it." She nodded, as if that solved something. "I didn't mean for it to start like that," she said. "I meant it to be honest." We sat on the porch in a silence that was not comfortable because everything between us had become heavy with meaning. Juniper's knee touched mine. The contact was small, but it made my body register its existence in a new language. An old map rediscovered, lines traced with fingertips. I began and stopped. Words had begun to betray me. to arrange themselves into excuses when what I needed was the bare, difficult truth. Do you want different things than what you had before Atlanta? She laughed quietly. I don't know what I want. Sometimes I think small towns swallow you if you let them. Other times I think they hold you like a hand. You know, gentle, but firm. Her thumb rubbed a rhythm against her wrist. She had that habit of rolling the seam of her sleeve between finger and thumb when she was thinking. Is this, I said, feeling foolish? Is this about being needed? Or about being wanted? She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the look on her face made me feel transparent. I wanted to be seen, Cora. Not as someone's project, not as someone's failure. But seen, just seen. The needle of that truth pricked something that had been tender in me for so long. Being seen was not the same as being looked at. It was more intimate and more dangerous. We were gradual then in ways that felt catastrophic. A hand placed at the small of a back when passing through a doorway. Fingers lingering at the hem of an apron while I tied it. The exchange of a plate left in a bathroom with a folded napkin. Each tiny theft of affection built into authorized trespass. I told myself that the familiarity of the house made our closeness innocuous. That if it remained contained it would be a mercy to my tired days. But secrets do not stay contained. They are drafty things that slip under doors and return swollen with news. One evening, Walter came into the kitchen earlier than usual, carrying 2 cans of beans and the kind of quiet that heralds a question he is saving. He leaned on the counter and watched us in the way husbands watch the weather, reading the sky for a storm. Juniper straightened as if she had been caught. She flashed a smile that belonged to a different woman, quick, apologetic. She set down her spoon. Everything all right? Walter asked, looking for the right thread to pull. Everything's fine, I said, too quickly. My voice sounded like someone else's. Walter's stare lingered on me and then on Juniper. You been nursin' the garden? He asked, allowing the lightness of the question to keep his eyes from finding something else. Yes, Juniper answered. Mrs. Cora's roses are doing much better. Walter grunted approvingly and moved on back to the pantry, the room swallowing him. After he left, Juniper and I exhaled in unison, the sound of it like something resetting. Moving on in a sequence that pretended nothing had happened. But the pretending never lasts long. One night, Alma came home earlier than usual, her coat damp from a brief rain. She carried a folded paper bag. Mama, I found this behind the upstairs piano, she said, putting the bag on the table. Her voice was casual, but there was a hardness to it that made the room drop temperature. My mouth went dry. The bag rustled when she lifted out what had been inside, a small, handwritten card, the edges frayed with handling. I had seen Juniper's handwriting once. Scrawled on that little folded slip from the festival, the hurried loop of her J. The sharp hook on her R's. A memory of the tiny note flared like a strike match. Alma's eyes flicked to mine. It says, "Don't make me do this alone," she read aloud. And then her gaze landed on Juniper. Did you leave this, Junie? Juniper's face went slack. No, she clutched the scarf at her throat as if it could anchor her. I didn't leave it. We'll talk about that later, Alma said, more coolly than I had heard her speak in years. She set the card back into the bag and folded it closed like a trap being set. Mama, how's the pie? She asked. And the question was an attempt to wedge the ordinary back into the fissure. After Alma left, the house had changed. She was moving through it with new intelligence, watching not because she suspected, but because she had discovered evidence and now was measuring where it might point. I felt my life shrink to the size of a coin, the edges suddenly serrated and dangerous. Juniper and I retreated into a kind of circumscribed caution. We met in the laundry room at odd hours, spoke through the crack of an open door, and made our conversations small and practical. There was a tenderness there, but it was cut with restraint. Restraint is a curious thing. It can be a bride, but it can also be a bell tolling the end. The more we stepped away from the open, the more I felt the pressure building, like steam in a kettle, taut with inevitable release. One afternoon, while Alma was at work and Walter out with the tractor, I found a juniper sprig tucked into the seam of my apron, a tiny, green thing. Fragrant and sharp, I realized immediately the symbolism, a name made into an emblem. My heart pounded like a child's. I turned it over in my fingers, the needles prickling my skin. Someone had left it there on purpose. Someone was not content with private signals. I wanted to throw it away. Instead, I placed it on the windowsill near the sink where the sunlight could dry it properly. It looked like a small, deliberate piece of the forest ashore at my kitchen window. The sprig would become another secret letter between two people who feared too much light. We argued once, softly, and with a fury that surprised me. Juniper had arrived one night drenched from a sudden rain. Her hair clung to her cheeks, and she smelled of wet grass. She took my hands in both of hers and said, "I'm leaving." I let my breath go out without knowing I had been holding it. "Leaving where?" I asked, because the word itself had many doors. "Back to Atlanta," she said. "I can't be what you need and what Alma needs. It's too complicated. I don't want to be whatever this is." I thought I wanted something honest, and now I think I wanted to escape a hole I dug in myself. "You can stay," I said, astonishing myself. It came out a plea. The implausibility of the offer tasted like honey on the tongue and vinegar afterwards. She pressed her forehead to mine. "You know I can't just stay because you ask." "No," I said, "you can't, you shouldn't, but I want you to." She laughed once, a brittle sound. And then she kissed me as if to seal the moment like a letter. "You always were good at convincing me," she whispered. The lie we told ourselves, that we could harbor a dangerous love in the quiet rooms of our lives, without consequence, began to fray. Small accidents accumulated into a pattern. A sweater left in the guest room. A receipt for coffee with 2 names on it. A message displayed for a second on Juniper's phone that she hastily slid away when I entered a room. Each piece did not by itself signify betrayal, but together they formed a constellation I could not ignore. I began to write. Not letters, not for her, though I thought of that, but pages. Confessions to a future self I imagined reading in a different decade. I wrote about being seen and being invisible. About the way love sometimes arrives like rain uninvited and refuses to leave. I wrote about the peach pie crust under my nails and the crescent of a moon over the chicken yard. I wrote about the note I had burned and what it had meant. The act of writing was selfish and brave both. It was my way of making order out of a life that had become scattered. The house kept its own counsel. The roosters crowed and the cicadas hummed. The world beyond our porch persisted in its small mercies. The mail came, the bills were paid. Alma's laugh could still fill a room. But there was a hinge somewhere between the present and the possible, and it was creaking. Then, one ordinary Thursday, Alma did the thing that changed everything. She came home early, and I was at the sink, hands in dishwater. The radio playing something old and mournful. She walked into the kitchen without knocking, something she had always done, and found me there. Jar in hand, a little juniper sprig drying on the windowsill like a secret bird. She looked at me for a long time, as if trying to read a map that had been redrawn since she'd last seen it. "Mama," she said, and the word was a careful instrument. "Who is Juniper to you?" The question was a blade in the room. My hands slipped. I could have lied. I had lied before, to myself, to others, to the calendar of my life, but lying then would have been a kind of theft from the person who had given me a name and years of patient shelter. I didn't know if confession would be relief or combustive. I only knew I could not keep standing on both sides of this fissure. I set the jar down and turned to her. The house seemed to inhale. "She's a friend," I said, and the word felt small and inadequate. Alma's eyes narrowed in a way that made me feel like glass. "A friend who leaves sprigs in your apron?" she asked. "A friend who burns notes at your sink?" I wanted to tell her everything at once, that I had been lonely for years, that the ache in my joints extended into the spaces of the heart, that Juniper's hand felt like an answer to a prayer I had forgotten how to pray. But the truth is a complicated thing. It does not fit neatly into a conversation over dishwater. Instead I said, "Yes. She's a friend." Alma's expression folded like paper. "I'll talk to her," she said, more gently than I expected, and then she left the room. When the door closed, the sound was like a verdict. I stood there for a long time, feeling the house press against me, listening to the rhythm of Walter's soft walk in the other room, to the fly of a curtain against the window. I thought of the note's ash, of the juniper sprig, of Juniper's scarf with its tiny beads. I thought of the way my life had been both a safe harbor and a small prison. And I realized with a clarity that was almost cruel that I had reached a point where every choice would bruise someone. If there is a morality to this story, it is not one I can claim to have known in advance. Love at my age was not a moral problem laid out in neat squares, it was a messy human calculus. In the kitchen, with the sink full of suds and the radio playing on, I felt the old rules I had followed all my life rearrange themselves. The choice: step back into the life I had built, stitch the seam tighter with apology and quiet touching up, or step forward and accept the upheaval, throbbed in me like a pulse I could not steady. I wiped my hands on a towel and looked at the window where the juniper lay drying. Outside, someone had left a lawn chair undone, and the sky over our porch had the thin clarity of late summer. I felt as if I stood at the lip of a field, with two paths before me, one well-trodden, the other thin and wild. Both would cost me dearly. Both would change the shape of what remained. Alma would talk to Juniper. Walter would notice something he could not put into words and suspect with the steady suspicion of a man who reads small signs as if he were a farmer reading soil. And Juniper would either leave or stay, and the consequence of either would ripple outward. I did not yet know which way the town would fall. Secrets in small towns have a way of becoming weather. They gather and then they fall as storms or as droughts. But sitting there in the kitchen, I felt the thin, sharp knowledge that choices could not be unmade, and that the self you revealed in the act of choosing might be the one that finally had to stand alone for whatever answer came next.